Have you heard this song before? Titled Scott Pilgrim vs. the World Ruined a Whole Generation of Women, this song mocks women who see Ramona as a symbol and the lifestyle her aesthetics evokes. And judging by the views, likes, and comments, hatred for artsy quirky alt-E girls seems to be a shared sentiment. This is ironic, since Scott Pilgrim never intended Ramona to be a role model. You're not supposed to be like her, and even the comments understood this. Because here's the thing.
You're not meant to idolize Ramona and the romantic ideals Scott Pilgrim projects onto her. It's the foundation of a toxic relationship, as their arc attempts to stray from this toxicity to become better people. But instead, Ramona is now seen as a symbol that has ruined a whole generation of women, at least according to this song. Satire or not, if you share the song's perception, then this perspective forever taints the movie for you. While this is a reason to hate the film, it's a reason that the movie has no control over.
This is where subjectivity and personal experiences come into play. Scott Pilgrim could hypothetically be the best young adult romantic comedy of all time, but if you hate young adult comedies, or if Ramona reminds you of someone you hate,
such as an ex,
then chances of you liking the movie are pretty slim. And for the sake of clarification, both of us like Scott Pilgrim. It was the movie that got me into movies, and both of us have referenced the franchise in our work in one way or another.
So our adoration for the film is very much apparent, but that doesn't mean we're blind to its flaws. Just because we love a piece of media doesn't mean we can't critique its faults. And as much as we enjoy the film,
and think the song is hyperbolic,
we still think Ramona is worthy of criticism.
And as a decade of our lives have passed while our understanding of film has widened, the movie's issues just seem so obvious to us now. Scott Pilgrim is a flawed cult classic, and there is a reason to dislike the movie that's beyond the contempt for dyed-haired e-girls. So let's get into it.
I fucking sit down when I pee sometimes, okay? I'm not less of a man because of it. I'm not less of a man just because sometimes I take a load off when I pee. I don't want to be standing when I pee.
For the uninitiated, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World tells an offbeat coming-of-age story about a 20-something-year-old who falls in love with the girl of his dreams. But in order to date her, he must first defeat her 7 evil exes in order to seal the deal.
So from the get-go, the premise is pretty ridiculous. Even if you didn't know about the hipsters or e-girls or whatever this film is associated with, this movie was going to turn off quite a few people. It's not exactly a Star Wars or the latest Avengers flick, which aims to appeal to the largest audience possible. From the humor, the aesthetic, to Michael Cera as the lead role, people who see this movie as just not their thing have every right to do so.
It's all about personal preference, and as a film further distinguishes itself from its contemporaries, broad appeal lessens whilst it cultivates a smaller and more dedicated audience. But as we said in the intro, catering to a specific audience doesn't automatically make it faultless to said audience.
Here's an example. I like pizza. But that doesn't mean I'm going to enjoy this overcooked mess you prepared for me because it resembles a pizza. Just because I like sci-fi stories doesn't mean I'm going to enjoy this mess that resembles a sci-fi story. In the same way a pizza can be ill-prepared, so can a story.
From containing inconsistent character motivation, having plot holes, or by being overly derivative of its inspirations. Objective flaws do exist in the realm of storytelling, and whether you enjoy a film despite its flaws is up to you, since most films contain their fair share of flaws.
And Scott Pilgrim is no exception. The film caters specifically to us, but we'd be idiots to call it perfect, especially when the movie's romance,
which is the thing the entire movie is built upon,
is fundamentally flawed.
And in the realm of quirky coming-of-age movies featuring a Manic Pixie dream girl, as specific as it is, Scott Pilgrim could have done it better. So, let's unpack this specific term and see where Scott fails in its attempt at a love story. The Manic Pixie dream girl is defined by 2 things. 1.
An attractive girl with eccentricities to signify she's not like the other girls, often showcased through an offbeat personality and her unique clothing choices.
And 2.
An underwritten character whose only purpose in the story is to serve the main character some cathartic life lessons, turning him from a sad sack to a guy who finally learns to love and live life.
And through this description, the Manic Pixie label was intended to be used as a critique. It was meant to critique underwritten quirky female saviors for troubled guys, as the lack of character development and agency is what defines a Manic Pixie dream girl. Instead of being written like a person, they're treated more like a tool, acting as a catalyst to kickstart our mopey guy's life. A fantastical solution to all of their problems.
Yet over time, the label has evolved beyond its original intent. Instead of being a useful term to describe poorly written, quirky female saviors, it eventually became a way of describing quirky female characters in general, which has led to the belief that quirkiness meant unrealistic portrayal of women or bad writing. This term has gone so misused that the creator of the label actually denounced it a few years after creating it. What was intended to critique shallow characters ended up blowing up in his face, as well-written characters were now also lumped under this unflattering label, a label that has gotten quite popular.
And since Ramona is often used as an example for the Manic Pixie dream girl, is she well written enough to escape the label's intended definition? Or is she just like the other girls?
Sadly, Ramona firmly fits in the original definition of a manic pixie.
While initially loving each other's company, Scott's dream girl perception of Ramona fades as he begins to realize that she isn't a dream girl at all. She's dumped every single boyfriend ex she's been with, and she's dated and dumped them for superficial reasons. This creates an insecurity within Scott in which he realizes his fantasy is actively hurting everyone around him. So in order to rectify this problem, he resets his life. Literally, lets out all the skeletons in his closet and wants to become a better person, showing that self-respect is more important than the power of love.
This is good on paper, and we personally like it a lot. But in execution, this felt rushed. The part where he realizes his mistakes and resets his life happens within the span of minutes, all towards the end of the movie, and we can only take Scott being a better person on his word alone. There are no examples of him being a better person beyond this scene. It's all tell and no show.
I would have loved an epilogue where he was trying to become a better person, possibly an end credits montage where it showed him getting a job, hanging out with Envy, or selling band shirts for Sex Bomb. Something indicative of Scott growing as a person after saying he's sorry.
But instead of any of that, all we're left with is Scott being rewarded with Ramona at the end.
Which feels odd.
The movie was explicit in saying self-respect triumphed over love. It made it clear that Ramona and Scott had little to no chemistry beyond their makeout sessions, which is even further supported by Gideon, the final ex, being mostly beaten up by Scott and Knives, who had the better friendship to begin with. So having the couple get back together after all this feels kind of forced.
At least in the alternative ending, Ramona leaves Scott for reasons consistent with her character. That's a better ending, right? Except he's rewarded with a 17-year-old high school girl. While Scott did have a better friendship with Knives than Ramona, Scott being rewarded with an impressionable 17-year-old girl that he initially exploited just a few days ago isn't a good look.
Especially when every level-headed character in the movie questions or mocks Scott after finding out about Knives' age. If the film ended with Knives saying she's too cool for Scott but is willing to stay friends, and the epilogue montage had them playing their arcade game, that'd be a lot more acceptable.
So while it seems like we're pulling this ending out of the blue, there's actually a movie that does this, essentially executing Scott Pilgrim's relationship but better. Our protagonist doesn't fight 7 evil exes, but he does get a satisfying resolution to his story, and all he had to do was spend 500 days with Summer.
Shrimpina meant everything to me. I only realise now she is gone. I never fully appreciated her.
So, what is 500 Days of Summer? It's a romantic comedy drama about a young guy who's obsessed with the girl he's just met, but eventually comes to terms with that there is life beyond love. So let's run down the similarities between Summer and Scott.
Both are coming-of-age stories from the late 2000s with a self-aware style that pays homage to popular media.
Scott has video games and comics, whilst 500 Days has romantic comedy movies.
Both love interests have something visually unique about them that helps them stand out.
Ramona's hair and Summer's blue clothing.
And both have a mysterious quality about them for one reason or another, having lives outside of the protagonists.
Why does Ramona have so many exes, and why does everybody love Summer?
Both feature quirky and offbeat humor, be it through the highs of their relationship or the lows of their breakups.
And these range of emotions are exaggerated with the film's visuals, aiming to properly convey the mind of a post-adolescent guy obsessed with a girl. Scott's romantic journey is conveyed like a video game, while Tom's perspective is through the lens of a typical cheesy Hollywood rom-com.
And finally, both of our protagonists are assholes. They're both inconsiderate, selfish, and see the girl as the answer to all the problems in their lives. So given these similarities, what makes 500 Days of Summer a better romance in our eyes?
It's because Scott ends up with the ending he wanted, but Tom ends up with an ending he needed. Scott winning the girl overshadows the more important resolution to his arc, which is winning the power of self-respect. Like we said, the movie tells us Scott has grown by the end, but we hardly get the chance to actually see it. Scott's story basically ends how it began, with him as the same bumbling love-struck 20-something-year-old, except now he said sorry and he's with the girl of his literal dreams.
Contrast this with 500 Days, where we actually get to see Tom's growth. From the get-go, the movie establishes that Tom is a hopeless romantic. He's the product of the media he's grown up with, which included a total misreading of The Graduate, and the one thing he learns from it all is that true happiness lies in finding the one.
This mindset, of course, has its faults, but it doesn't stop him from forging his fantasy of the perfect dream girl, someone to save him from his risk-averse life with a job that he doesn't care for. Enter Summer, the cute new girl at his dreary office to which he projects all his Hollywood fantasies on. And let it be known, she's not like the other girls. She listens to the Smiths.
After 90 minutes of our boy pulling every rom-com cliche in the book, he ultimately doesn't end up with Summer. They have a fun, if not short-lived fling, but she was never after a long-term relationship, something she repeatedly stated to Tom, yet he continuously ignored. It's here where we can see his parallels with Scott's character. Both dudes almost see their love interests as trophies, and never mind their baggage or wants, as long as they get their happy, romantic ending.
Which is why Tom ending up single isn't the happily ever after he wanted, but it was the ending he needed. Through this heartbreak, he ends up maturing. He questions his perspective of love, he comes to terms with the mistakes he's made with Summer, and he eventually learns to let go of her. It's a sad love story for our leading man, but it's positive growth for his character.
He's at a better place by the movie's finale, whereas Scott's character just kinda stays the same. He's a dick, but then he's a nice guy because he says he's sorry. This would have been less jarring if Scott and Ramona had any sort of chemistry, but it's pretty much absent throughout the movie.
Ramona acts more like a plaything for Scott, and Scott and Ramona's scenes merely exist to set up punchlines, which is totally intentional and works to great effect, but when the movie ends with Scott together with Ramona, it feels unearned. Why is Ramona back with Scott? Just because he said sorry?
If Ramona's indifference for Scott was amped up more to the point where she left Scott in the no hard feelings, this was just a fling type of way, that would be more in line with her character. But instead we're stuck in this kind of gray area with Ramona. She kind of cares for Scott, but the couple don't really have the chemistry to back it up. Even on a platonic level, they don't even come off as good friends, which makes them getting back together feel odd and tacked on.
But then you have a look at 500 Days of Summer, where Tom and Summer's relationship feels more believable. And it's not merely because of Summer's more bubbly personality. It's because Summer is actively engaging with Tom. They have conversations about their personal interests, daydream about the future, and partake in activities that make it look like they are enjoying each other's company.
They even have meaningful, heart-to-heart conversations about their personal histories. And while a flashback shows that their time together wasn't all fun and games, the highlights we see in Tom's 500 Days of Summer seemed like a good time. They looked like a young couple in love, which makes Summer's decision to not be with Tom all the more heartbreaking.
And this is why Summer isn't a Manic Pixie dream girl, because Manic Pixies are defined by their lack of character and agency, and Summer is written like a real person. She does have desires and ambitions beyond Tom, which is best highlighted in this scene. After a prolonged absence due to a lover's quarrel, Summer invites Tom to a party to catch up on some lost time. And while Tom imagines a scenario where he reunites with his true love and they go back to the way things were,
Reality shows that Tom was too nervous to do anything, only to find out Summer ended up being engaged during their time apart. We get to know about Summer's life as much as Tom, which turns out to not be all that much. To Tom's disbelief, Summer does actually have a life.
A girl who laughed at your jokes and also liked the same things as you did wasn't really all that into you? Crazy, impossible, right? But this heavily weighs on Tom's mind, to the point where he is an absolute wreck of a person, and seeing what type of miserable soul he has become, he picks himself up piece by piece and works towards a better life through a montage.
He cleans up his apartment, he starts planning things, and he pursues a career which his previously risk-averse personality wouldn't allow him to. And through the shift from broken, hopeless romantic to a motivated hard worker, we see an evident positive transformation in Tom's character.
While Scott has learned self-respect through a flashy sword by standing up for himself and then saying sorry to the people he's hurt, Tom earns his self-respect by actually becoming a better person.
Tom's now a person who has grown out of his unrealistic expectations. He's ditched the rose-tinted glasses and now lives a better life because of it. And as the film ends with Tom meeting a new girl named Autumn, it hints at the idea of a second chance. This new girl isn't perceived as a reward for being a good boy, but rather an opportunity to become the person he should have been with Summer in the beginning.
And that's how you write character growth. That's how you write an unlikable guy who ends up becoming a better person. Not through cheap words, but through their actions. And while you may say this critique is unwarranted and the Scott Pilgrim movie is just supposed to be dumb fun, that's understandable. The movie is dumb and it is fun. But we have to acknowledge Edgar Wright's intent. In this Vanity Fair interview, Wright says this:
I think, if nothing else, the experience helps him become more mature. He's really cocky and confident with Ramona at first, but as he starts to meet more of the exes, it sets off a number of insecurities, to the point where he isn't really sure if he wants to fight for her anymore. He's done jumping through hoops for her.
This quote proves that Scott's growth was clearly intended. But given our comparison between 500 Days of Summer and Scott Pilgrim, we think it's pretty clear who handled the subject of mature growth better.
Gamer dudes and dudettes, when it comes to keeping your gaming gear at peak performance, oh, the games people play.
Now, despite all its apparent flaws, Scott Pilgrim isn't a bad film. In fact, it's a movie that excels in quite a few ways. From a technical visual standpoint, it's a film with top-notch editing. Mr. Wright has a noticeable visual flair, and with clever uses of split screens, cutaways, and stunts, this movie's production doesn't look like it was half-assed. The amount of creativity in planning to execute these jokes required time and care.
And though the movie does pay homage to other pop culture mediums, each reference feels purposeful while never being excessive nostalgia bait. And in a movie whose whole visual style is rooted in a mixture of comics and games, things could have been a lot worse.
So it's settled. The fate of Doctor Who's TARDIS will be decided by a Game of Thrones-inspired deathmatch on the battlefield of Thundercats versus Transformers.
Fuck you! Where was the joke? He just f***ing named a bunch of shit! How is this comedy?
When you compare it to other recent media, who expect to be rewarded for merely referencing something you remember, Scott Pilgrim attempts to do more than this. Instead of remember this solely being the joke, their references work alongside the jokes, like conveying a character's personality.
Hi. What do you play?
Wow, Zelda, Tetris. That's kind of a big question.
Even if you find these moments unfunny, at least these jokes are achieving things beyond referencing something. They don't exist just to pander to the audience. Be it in the references, the humor, or its visuals, what's implemented in the movie is executed with purpose. Just look at the fight scenes.
From Lucas's skateboard scene, Todd's bass battle, to Matthew Patel's Bollywood number, each battle is unique in presentation to enhance the film's eccentric visual style.
And each X is defeated in a different way, which helps the fights from feeling samey. Add on the comic book inspired visual effects, and you've got a live action movie that has gone unreplicated since its release in 2010.
Besides the live action Cowboy Bebop promo material, which looked pretty creative.
But the actual show wasn't very...
Yeah, let's not talk about that. And not only is the movie visually distinct, but sonically as well. Scott Pilgrim isn't just a coming of age romantic comedy action movie, it's also a musical. And like most most musicals, these songs function as a form of character expression.
From the expressive garage rock of Sex Bomb, the resentful pop punk of Black Sheep, to the sincerity of Ramona, these songs are just another way to add color to these characters, which ends up making the film's personality even more distinct. And with most of these genres associated with young teens and adults, dealing with young adult matters of love and relationships, how's it not fitting to have these songs permeate throughout the film?
That's not to say the movie takes itself too seriously on these issues. It's still a goofy movie, and with a premise like Scott Pilgrim's, you gotta lean into that goofiness. And thankfully, Wright does goofy fantastically.
Wow. Wow. Wow.
The comedy is snappy and precise, which allowed the film to squeeze a lot of personality in a small amount of time. Just look at the X's. They only get a few minutes of screen time each, and yet each one feels distinct with a memorable scene. Which is impressive, since larger studios have enough trouble introducing new characters in an ensemble cast.
And it goes without saying, the rest of the supporting cast is great as well.
17 years old, scandal.
That's not true. Who told you?
Wallace, duh.
That gossipy bitch. You know me.
Wallace!
Nice! You punched the highlights out of her hair.
He punched the highlights out of her hair!
A gig is a gig is a gig is a gig. Maybe you can put your history aside until we get through this thing, you know, for the band. For the band. For the band. Can't we do our For the band?
This is a level of campy fun that we adore, and it's present throughout the film. From the fight scenes, the wardrobe, to shots like these, camp is integral to the movie's whole vibe, and why would you want to be overly serious with such a ridiculous concept?
Now, onto Michael Cera as Scott. We know that people don't like Michael Cera as a lead because he is Michael Cera. He isn't the boisterous loudmouth that's depicted in the comics, nor is he the typical leading man who gets the girl. However, we think his awkward interpretation of Scott works great for the film. It adds to the absurdity that a dopey-looking guy like Scott can be a great fighter, and Cera's comedic chemistry with the rest of the cast is great in general. Dude bounces off of everyone really well.
And as much as the romance didn't quite work for us, Ramona and Scott's scenes are still pretty great. It's romantically unsatisfying, but Winston and Cera nailed down that awkward couple comedy perfectly. Whether that's something you enjoy is really up to personal preference. And when a movie's personality is as striking as Scott Pilgrim's, it's all about personal preference. The movie's premise, visuals, or comedy may be a bit much for you, and that's totally fine, but it's these very aspects as to why we, and other Scott Pilgrim fans, love the film.
It's a comedy that excels in its technical aspects with an aesthetic that has resonated with a passionate cult following. A live-action aesthetic that has gone unreplicated since its release. And when compared to other films that have a video game influence, it's definitely the one with the most creativity. So, if anything, I think Scott Pilgrim at least deserves praise for that, even if you see the film as not your thing. Given the movie's strong personality, it's undeniable that Scott Pilgrim vs. the World was not gonna be for everyone. Its premise is absurd, its aesthetics bold, influences clear, and its characters seem to be associated with a particular image.
And while these are points of contention for several people, they're the very elements that make it the beloved film it is. Strip away any of these aspects and the movie ceases to be Scott Pilgrim.
Take away its underground band aesthetic, then it becomes another story starring dudes who like video games. Take away the video game inspiration and it becomes another quirky romantic comedy. Take away the absurd premise and it's another schmaltzy coming-of-age Manic Pixie Dream Girl film.
And look, none of these genres are inherently bad, but after a while it's easy for things to feel a bit samey. And while 500 Days of Summer stands out as a coming-of-age romantic comedy,
while also making an impact on internet culture,
its identity is nowhere near as recognizable as Scott Pilgrim.
And it's this well-defined personality, this amalgamation of ideas that resonates with fans the most. Even after over a decade of its release, its influence still manages to find a way into other media and public conversation throughout the years.
Still, despite the well-deserved adoration this movie has built over time, a decade of consuming other media changes your perspective, helping us see the cracks in things that were previously invisible to us.
So while our love for Scott Pilgrim stands strong to this day, it's hard to deny the faults the movie does have. Cause when it comes down to it, the romance and character growth were clearly the movie's weakest points.
Which makes the Manic Pixie Dream Girl criticism, despite its history of misuse, end up being the perfect description for Ramona. Especially when she's contrasted to someone like Summer. Just because they're someone's dream girl doesn't mean they're a manic pixie. She achieves the same goals as Ramona without being underwritten. And if Summer could have done it, it's a shame that Ramona couldn't.
But despite its faults, spending 10 years with Scott has made us appreciate the things that still hold up today. So when a movie manages to be as unique as it is, with no other movie like it in the past decade, we think that's an achievement worth acknowledging. Here's a huge thanks to both Anna and my patrons. So Anna over here makes video essays on pop culture and media, with her Manic Pixie Dream Girl video inspiring this whole collab in the first place. And with that knowledge, not only was she a guest speaker for this video, but she also helps co-write the script. So if you like her presence and contribution, go check out her stuff. Links to her channel are in the description and at the end. And here's another thank you to my patrons for making this all possible. They've supported me with cold hard cash from a warm and appreciative community, and it's neat of them to keep me afloat and less reliant on YouTube's algorithm. They're kinda neat. And if you don't like memberships or subscriptions and you just want to donate once, there's the YouTube super thanks function, or just donating to my PayPal. So yeah, that's it. Here's one of Anna's videos, and here's my Patreon. Thanks for supporting either of us, and I hope you enjoyed your time here.